Hey, hi man, you wanna sit down man? Funny how you don't get me though, you wanna hold me close like chill man. I hear they do for my life is inevitable. My using me get to them cameras, I make you feel invisible.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the AARENA, a space for honest conversations on accountability and good governance in Africa. I'm excited about today's conversation because we have a live audience of young people across Southern and Eastern Africa. Please make some noise to confirm that you're here with me and you're excited. Great. So today being the first conversation with a live audience, we want to speak about all things to do with civic leadership. So those young people, they're here in Nairobi for a boot camp where they are getting some learning, some mentorship and some training on civic engagement. And for this particular boot camp, we are looking at civic leadership holistically. We're looking at engagement, accountability and rights. To help me unpack this heavy conversation is an esteemed panel of the lovely lady in the middle and the gentleman who are joining me here, whom I'm going to introduce to you shortly. But what we want to do is to have a conversation that responds to two major questions. One, we want to establish why it is important for young leaders to be interested in work that has to do with digital governance and climate justice. Does it really matter? And secondly, where is the intersection in that work with all things to do with rights and accountability? So to help me unpack this conversation and to explore how far we can get, I have Tabani Moyo, who is the Regional Secretariat Director for Media Institute Southern Africa, MISA, working at the intersection of media, AI, governance across Southern Africa. Tabani, welcome.
Thank you.
And then we have Titus Gitonga, who is a good governance and anti-corruption advocate. He works with Transparency International Kenya, and he's deeply engaged in public finance, anti-corruption, and civic accountability. Titus, welcome.
Thank you.
Last but not least, and they say we honor the ladies, but she's coming up last. She is Wairimu Manyara, who is a lawyer and is involved in work to do with justice, energy, transition here in Africa. Welcome. And she's actually bringing a wealth of knowledge with everything to do with energy policy, climate justice, and youth leadership. Welcome. Great. So to kickstart this conversation, I want you to bring us to your portfolios, where you are standing, to define these big terms that I just mentioned. We spoke about civic engagement, rights, digital governance, climate justice, accountability. What are those things? I'll start with you, Tamani. What exactly do we mean when we say digital governance?
Thank you for the invitation, and firstly to acknowledge the brilliance of the minds that the young people from the community of East and Southern Africa bringing to the room. It then answers the question, what is digital governance? Broadly, these are the frameworks and norms, practices that are shaping how the digital technologies are being developed or deployed and used, and equally so managed within the society. Probably in a four-dimensional manner. You look at the institutional dimension. What are the institutions in place to lead the governance process in its development, deployment, and management of the same platforms? At this level, you are looking at multilateral institutions, governments, local institutions, among others, that are involved in the process. The other one is the participatory dimension. The United Nations actually pushes for a stakeholder approach to internet governance or these digital tools governance, so that no one is left behind. So no other voices should be excluded from managing these platforms and technologies to ensure that they are representative of the entire society at large. The third element, probably the other critical component, is the rights-based approach to the concept of management of the internet and digital technologies. In most instances, we realize that governments will push for a security-centered approach to governance of the platforms, which will then impact heavily on the rights such as privacy and data governance, among others. So we want a rights-based approach, which is balanced in terms of our security needs, but also on our digital rights, as we express online. The last component, which we, in relation to this matter, is accountability. How are we accountable? Firstly, as the platforms who are enabling the enjoyment of these rights online, how accountable are they to the communities they are serving? You talk of the big tech in terms of rolling out their platforms. Are they not intruding into private information and utilizing it beyond the means they are supposed to utilize it accordingly? Or if it is the government, which is supposed to be a custodian of our rights and pushing through as duty bearers, are they not overstepping and stepping in the users' rights? Above all, the user themselves, are they not abusing their rights to expression and bordering on trotting on other rights of other citizens? So that accountability mechanism then completes the cycle of digital governance as a four-dimensional step. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tabani. I like the definition because you do not only unpack what digital governance is, but you went on to unpack accountability and rights within digital governance. Thank you very much for that. Over to you, AARENA.
Thank you. So I think that was a great, I think he unpacked it well in terms of he touched on issues of rights. And so when we speak to climate justice, which is, I think, a word that we've had numerous times, and we never really know how to define it. In fact, if you're to Google it, it says it's a goal. And in other places, it says it's a process. In other places, it says it's advocacy that's targeted, right? But if you think about it, climate justice is an end in itself, but it's a goal, but it's a process in itself as well, right? So how I see or how I look at it is in terms of the act of pushing towards having more inclusivity, to have more equity towards the process of, if it's decarbonization, if we're solving, and maybe here, let me work my thoughts back, right? So the goal is to decarbonize, and the goal is to reach a certain set of emissions, and that's going to always be a political term, whether it's 2 degrees, whether it's below that. That's always going to be a political term. But I think climate justice then brings about the how element in how we do it, right? It's not necessarily just making sure that we've decarbonized our institutions, that we've decarbonized our world. It's ensuring that those who are most marginalized in this process are catered for. It's also ensuring that in this process in itself, right, we're not just transitioning to a system that then places people in other injustices or in other places of inequity, and that's where the aspect of energy justice comes in, right? So if we're going to have a transition towards renewable energy, which is necessary to be decarbonized, because the energy sector in this case tends to be one, the easiest to be decarbonized, but globally has the highest set of emissions. Does that mean that then we'll have solar power plants that have communities benefiting from those plants in themselves? Does that mean that we have transparent processes? Does that mean that then we don't kick people out of their land in order to cater for these solar plants? Does it mean that then we don't have the most expensive electricity? If, for example, in Kenya, it's geothermal, which tends to be very pricey, that then the people cannot be able to afford. So we don't necessarily, and so what climate justice encompasses, it's all those aspects. It's if we're transitioning for all, and we're transitioning for even the most marginalized people to be able to afford and to be able to survive in the future that we're going into. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Wairimi. I like how your definition, it has community at the center, and it grounds us into the issue of justice. Thank you for that. And for you, Titus?
Yeah, thanks, Dlamini, and I'm very happy to be amongst innovators and creatives and really good ideas that have been shared throughout. But just for me, I think Tabani has really put on the spot digital governance and Wairimu on climate justice. So I would focus mostly on accountability. So at TI, or as a movement, we look at accountability in two aspects. So there is what we call vertical accountability, and there is horizontal accountability. So vertical accountability, or accountability as a wholesome, is all intertwined under what we call the social contract theory, which would be a long lecture on how we came about to have constitutions. But ideally, the constitutions that we have as different countries set out the rules of how the citizens and those who bear responsibilities are supposed to engage. And that is the basis for accountability. So when you're talking about vertical accountability, is the two actors. There is the right holder, where else is a citizen, and the duty bearer, who is either a public officer, civil servant, state officer, or the people holding public office. So accountability, of course, again, holds in two ways: that the citizen, in this case the right holder, has certain rights, and these rights have been enshrined either in law or in other policy documentation, and the other person or the government or government entities are supposed to fulfill those rights. So how they fulfill those rights, they're accountable to the citizens who have put them in those positions. So that sort of relationship, also as a citizen or as a right holder, you also have responsibilities. So if there's a right to, for instance, education, you also have that responsibility to ensure that you show up, you go into these spaces of education, that when if there is a right to information, is that when the information is provided, you seek the information and you use that information. So there is corresponding rights and responsibilities across. So that is between citizens and the right holders and the duty bearers. Then there is a horizontal accountability. So horizontal accountability comes in where institutions have to check each other. And that is where you get the concept of separation of powers. Like we have the executive, we have in a lot of our country setups in terms of governance, we have the executive, that is the presidency, we have the parliaments that represent the people, and we have the judiciary that supersedes interpretation of the law and all that. So that sort of separation of powers ensures that there's a balance of how the rights and responsibilities are being actioned, and that there is no one body that is overally above the rest, other than in Kenya we say the people are supreme. The constitution is the one that sets the boundaries, and therefore everybody should be able to operate within an accountability spectrum that respects where each of us has responsibilities and yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. I think that's very clear, because you're establishing the different levels of accountability. And I'm sure the young leaders who are here in the room, they can establish where exactly their work fits and how best they can advocate for justice. So now that we have an idea and we understand, I hope, what digital governance, climate justice, and accountability is, I would like to invite Tabani to tell us from his perspective what some of the trends globally and regionally that he has picked up, that he has noticed, witnessed, and experienced through his work, that probably has made the most shift within the region and within the globe generally, which would actually make us argue that issues of digital governance are important and we should take action.
Thank you very much. I think we must maintain the big picture, and for the young dynamic minds and thinkers in the room, should always realize that beyond the specific interventions that are happening within the local context, there's always a bigger ecosystem outside it. And if you are talking of the SDGs, which we are in the last 5 years of them, which means that 5 years to the lane, but the report of the UN states that we are less than 70% in achieving them. What it means is that 70% of the SDGs are African problems. And if we are 70% from reaching them, we are 70% away from resolving African challenges. Secondly, the African Union Agenda 2063, which we have lapsed the first 10 years. We are left with almost 40 years now but when we're talking of 50 years in future, is also indicating that by far we are yet to reach the 7 aspirations which are critical, which includes digital transformation. So part of these broader global picture issues are speaking of digital governance as an enabler towards fixing our problems as an African society. So the young problem solvers in the room should be alive to the fact that we rely on you to scale up digital transformation. Why? Because at the moment we still have the challenge of internet penetration, mainly because the infrastructure is still dominated by global players and within the reach of urban societies. So the need to scale up that digital transformation is critical towards resolving the SDGs, which are about to end, the Agenda 2063, towards an Africa that we want, that is peaceful, united, and broad-based economic inclusion of the bulk of the colleagues. Then the second issue is around the regulatory deficits. That's an area we are seeing across the continent, in that most of the technologies are being developed and deployed way faster than the regulatory frameworks, which increases vulnerabilities of the societies that we are operating in. So if you look at mobile money, if you look at issues to do with AI deployment and development, the regulations are lagging behind, and this is on large scale across the continent. Then you tie up with issues of cybersecurity, how the platforms are vulnerable and with limited recourse in terms of legal actions is so paramount. Content regulation, which is in most instances politicized rather than enabling, so that you have a society that is in conversation with itself. Then the issues of governance of AI. I'm with the African Union Working Group on AI. We have pushed for a strategy which was adopted, and the major headache is how do we move from strategy to implementation? Even those other countries that are yet to start conversations around strategy, but still, as you begin the conversations around strategy, you have a clear picture on how you are going to have probably a 3-legged approach of strategy which encapsulates the vision of how you want to develop and deploy AI, of the regulatory framework as the second layer, and finally the implementation matrices. How do you make it adoptable, wide scale in the continent? My last point, which is around information integrity. And most of us operate within the context of an African society that gears itself, it becomes alive during elections. And the layers of information determines how the election goes, whether it is going to be fair, free, accountable for. But also it can trigger early warning systems if we have got proper indicators to track. Hence the need to have an ingrained interest in information integrity, solutions that ensure that the information that reaches the ultimate citizen is as closer to accuracy as it is possible, so that we manage our societies so that they don't disintegrate or plunge into some critical challenges that are induced by misinformation. I know McDonald always said lastly and keeps on going. But there is also an intersection, which is what we are seeing, intersection of the climate justice issues, gender, in terms of the critical inclusion components of the economic aspects and geopolitics. But because of time limits, I'll rather stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I feel like a lot of issues that you raised there, and I'm hoping that the young leaders here are going to react, because they're very critical issues that you've just raised there in sharing the perspective. I'd like to move over to you, Waremu, to find out from your perspective what are some of the most trends in the global and regional spaces that have led to climate justice being an important issue in Africa.
Okay. Thank you so much for that question. And I think a lot of young people here probably know the answers to these questions, and it's what we're experiencing every day. I think, first of all, I think we'll start at a global level when we had in COP29 in Baku, when the new climate finance targets moved to 300 billion per year by 2035. And what that just meant is that there's more galvanization, right? There's more money coming into solving some of our challenges with mitigation and adaptation. And so this is a major shift. And again, I'm not saying that it's amazing. It's been implemented well, right? I just think this shows that there's a lot of support and there's a lot of traction moving. I think the war right now in the Middle East is a key factor. I think one of the main things it's pushing towards is that it's training African economies to see that, first of all, we are holders of critical minerals, the largest deposits of critical minerals globally, right? But we still rely on, ancient supply chains in the fact that we have to ship them to be able to get them back in terms of our beneficial value. And so what that means is also we're also getting more cognizant of the fact that we're relying on those supply chains. We're relying on oil in itself, which means any global disruption, which we have nothing to do. Kenya has nothing to do with Iran and the US, but at the end of the day, we're all facing impending fuel shortages, right? And so it's realizing also the need for us to secure our own economies, to secure our own ecosystems, and why in this case, being holders, for example, of critical minerals, having capacity to be able to deploy clean energy, which in itself we can be able to do within the continent without needing to import, then is essential for our own survival. But also I think next is there's been several global initiatives, and here in this case I say global referring to mission, like the Mission 300 initiative, which seeks to fund 600 million Africans. So 600 million Africans in sub-Saharan Africa don't have access to electricity, and so the project ideally seeks to finance projects towards having more people access power. And I think we hear of these schemes at a global scale, but then when you look at how they come down or trickle down to our economies, I think almost every country here, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, Kenya, all have energy compacts. And what this means is that our countries have made certain commitments in these compacts. For example, I think in Tanzania, it's to review your national energy policy, which is something that has been quite outdated. And so what does that mean in terms of factoring into new generation capacity? If you see, for example, and I'm using Tanzania as an example because it's always very perplexing, right? They rely highly on gas and they rely highly on gas particularly, and want to continue exploring a lot of gas, which is a fossil fuel. It's highly unsustainable. But you see when you see their projections of, for example, geothermal, which they have a lot of capacity in geothermal, they have a lot of capacity in wind, they have a lot of capacity in solar, they don't want to invest in it, right? They currently don't have infrastructure, but they don't want to generate or develop more infrastructure to exploit some of these resources. So you find that global compacts, you find that Mission 300 compacts, for example, or global trends, right, can sometimes push our local governments towards incentivizing things like clean energy. There's a lot of conversation happening in, at the World Bank right now and at the African Development Bank as to whether they're willing to support gas projects. It's unlikely that they're going to support gas projects. So what does this mean for a young climate activist in Tanzania, right? It means that you can push your government back in terms of a lot of the gas projects that they have coming in. And so there are a lot of, I think, movements that are trickling down globally that then can still be able to be scaled down and can be able to be implemented by some of us as we sit here. And I'm going to avoid taking any more time. But just in terms of even the shift, right? I think there's been a shift with, Donald Trump coming into power, with USAID getting disbanded basically, and a lot of the aid world has basically been disheveled and it's been, disorganized. But I think this also presents certain opportunities, particularly for a lot of us sitting here in this room. It means that, one, we have to re-strategize. We have to look at different avenues to be able to raise this capital. If it means, for example, 300 billion is being pledged at COP, how many of these projects are being pledged, first of all, as grants as opposed to loans, right? And even if it's loans, how concessional are these loans, right? You find a lot of these loans that go to developing countries are at 8%, when the ones that go to developed countries are at 1%, when they come to developing countries they're at 8%, and you'll be told it's because of your currency depreciation and your risk capacity and the fact that your projects aren't necessarily as bankable. But it just makes us then shift our perspective towards where do we, now that because we follow the money, it sounds horrible, but we do follow the money. And now that the global trend in terms of where the money is coming from has shifted, where can we be able to push for more traction? There's a lot of private finance coming in. There's a lot of push actually to have a lot of the climate funds move towards grants as opposed to maintaining the current system that exists. So where we are as young activists on the continent, how exactly can we be able to leverage these trends? Yeah.
Nice. That is a very comprehensive perspective. And it's challenging me to read more about climate justice because there are really these interesting things that you are bringing on the table. And I'm sure they're triggering some reactions from the young people who are here present. So we're speaking about digital governance, about climate justice, and you come in wearing the accountability hat. Ground us. What are some of the accountability issues within these two issues that we've raised that you feel like you have noticed them globally and they're trickling down regionally and trickling down locally?
Thanks. So, in terms of the movements on digital and climate issues on accountability, I think our indices that get us to understand how accountability issues, especially within the public sector, operate is a corruption perception index. So you realize that at the corruption perception index, the sub-Saharan region is among it's the worst performing region globally on anti-corruption. So a lot of our countries, of course, I think the average is 43 out of 100 being a good mark. So already we are below average in terms of how we deal with public sector corruption. And when you go now to individual countries like Kenya, 30 out of 100 already shows you how badly we are performing when it comes to public sector corruption. So, and corruption again is also a manifest of bad governance or bad leadership. So leadership is one of the areas that I would flag out when it comes to, again, Warimu has already pointed out from last year, the change of leadership in the US and its impact on governance work across all sectors like climate justice, digital governance, or security, peace and security, all these things. There was a lot of kind of leadership that the United States through the USAID was supporting globally. But this support again has really gone, and it behoves us to take leadership in other spaces and rethink our strategies, like Warimu has said. So under this is how do we ensure that there is continuous sustained engagements on issues of digital governance and climate justice, is ensuring that we are able to enshrine within the available accountability mechanisms. So in digital governance, I think we've seen a lot of push towards the kind of innovations, local innovations, where people look at misinformation, disinformation, and trying to debug a lot of this information on how the information should be flowing, but also countering a lot of the securitization approach towards regulation of the digital space. I think a lot of you followed in June 2024 when there was a Gen Z revolution here in Kenya. Part of the issues that were coming up was on the taxation of the digital economy, and that alongside is where a lot of the young people, like Africa's median age is 19 years. Like if you imagine, like majority of the future belongs to those who are not in decision making. A lot of you are not in decision making positions, but the future belongs to you. So how do we participate more in ensuring that the future then is secured from bad decisions currently? So there is that bit of just creating digital platforms. In Kenya, I've seen platforms that try to even analyze data like Auditor General reports, where we've also tried to restructure this into programs where there's citizen accountability audits. Like citizens are part of audit processes of ensuring that they're able to monitor what public resources are doing. So other than use of digital tools, like for instance, when you're talking about climate justice, as TI, we focus mostly on climate financing. And we have developed platforms like a Climate Finance Watch tool that tries to bring data on what resources are going to climate finance and how people can follow and get, even on carbon credits, what is going to who and what is that doing. It's not just about the money, following the money, but also the impact of the money that is going into certain actions. So there is quite a bit that needs to be done in terms of creating awareness, but using our civic tech tools to provide that sort of accountability is a drive towards us securing our future as young people, not to be derailed by those who are in positions of decision making. Yeah.
Lovely. So the work that you're doing with Transparency International is incredible. And I like how you already have trackers that are feeding into monitoring how resources are managed, especially resources directed towards mitigating climate crisis. And I'm also happy to connect this with some of the initiatives that these young people have. I know there's one who has an initiative where they are tracking budget management. That's Zimbabwe. There's Menashe from Zimbabwe. I know it's doing that. And there are a whole lot others. But I'm not going to take this spotlight. I'm going to actually open the platform and hear their reactions to what has been shared with you. What are some of the issues that you're finding interesting? Are there comments? Are there questions?
Probably I'll take 3 and then we bring it back this side.
Thank you very much. I think mine goes to all the panelists in terms of the work that we are doing of accountability, which is also married to the concept of democracy, as you were speaking about. And in this growing, misinformation to say within young people, and even if you go to Afrobarometer research, you'll see that more than 56% of young people are ready and willing to have a military takeover as long as those that are grabbing power are going to address what they need. What does it say to democracy? You hear young people when we do our activities. If you want to start to talk about democracy, they say what is needed in Zimbabwe is benevolent, dictatorship. They will give you examples of Traore. And in all that, space, how can we try to reignite the thought to say, no, democracy might not be the best way of organizing society, might not be the perfect way of organizing society, but at least with the options that we have, it is the progressive way that we can be able to make sure that there is participatory democracy, but anchored on the principles of accountability. Because we go back to climate justice, they tell you that we vote for a person who is going to, to make sure that our minerals are taken by Chinese. You come to Zimbabwe, the influx of Chinese. You want us to vote for people that are going to beg, to the West as far as, this discourse of critical minerals is concerned. While in Africa, we have more than 30% of the world's proven critical minerals that are at the center of the climate, justice discourse, of the just transition discourse. So how do we operate in such an environment? Or to the panelists, maybe you also share the same sentiments. Maybe we need military dictatorship in Africa. So share with us.
Hi, my name is Biadas Blemsemange, and mine is just a comment on what Walimu said about just transition in terms of energy. It's also building on a conversation I had on X Space last Friday with Southern Africa Trust. So in terms of in Malawi, when it comes to energy and transitioning, I'll take it to the local scenario whereby if you're found carrying charcoal in your car, the police will take it away from you. But if you go to that policeman's house, he's using charcoal because over 70% of the Malawian population doesn't have access to electricity. And even when you think of the other options, they are not really sustainable for a normal day-to-day Malawian. So for me, I just really liked how she touched on it, and also how we really need to find ways of making the energy transition just for everybody. It has to be inclusive, so that, because the people who go there cutting down trees, it's not that they don't know that it's bad for the environment, but they have no other option. So how do you make it understandable to that person? How do we get that information to them? And how do we tell their stories so that also when we are formulating all these policies, it actually reflects what's happening on the ground? Yeah.
Thank you so much. A question directly to Mr. Taban. In Uganda, last year we had elections. The national elections were conducted, we chose the leaders. But during the process, internet was shut down, was censored, so we couldn't access all the digital platforms, including mobile money. Mr. Taban, could you kindly tell us which strategy could best be used to mobilize young people in such situations? So what is the best way on how do we handle this in general?
Right. I'll bring back the mic. Let's just give them a moment to respond to your questions. Maybe Titus, you can take the one by Monashe, and then.
Thanks. And I think it's a correct observation on the kind of leadership crisis we are having globally. Within our African states, I like calling it, we have moved from leadership to dealership. A lot of the guys in positions of power are just there for the deals that are coming with those positions. And unfortunately, even for some of the people seeking to get into those positions, like you talk to some of those who want to get into leadership, and you want to feel, what is your motivation? What have you done within your community? What leadership have you sort of exercised within your community? And you can really tell that people are there to get the perks or to be in positions of power, so that you're able to, like the experience that we've had in Kenya, to evade accountability. Because when you're there as either a member of parliament or as a president or deputy president, there are things that you will not be held accountable for. So there is definitely that crisis, and that is why it's important. Like I've said, the future belongs to us. Like a lot of those, unfortunately, again, much as we are saying the median age in Africa is 19 years, a lot of those were in leadership. I don't know, we can start with any country. I don't want to mention names, but you kind of look at the leadership, it does not reflect the majority of those who are living in those countries, and therefore they are not very much invested in the future of those countries. So as young people, we need to really think through what we are. I've never been a military person, so I do not know the thinking. We also have very backward and people within the military who could take your countries to very bad situations. So again, that is not something I would personally advocate for, but it's for us, it's just going back to the social contract. Like who is the boss? It's the citizens. So if the citizens have their say, then ideally the leadership should be a reflection of that say. So really protecting institutions that are supposed to guard democracy. So there are those institutions that are supposed to ensure that there is democracy. Not even now going to the government, political parties. Are we as young people part of political movements? Have we created political movements? Are we part of those discourses? So that we are part of the change that we are looking for in terms of the democracies that we hope to see in these countries. So really being part of the solution is, again, like a lot of you guys are already doing, being leaders within your own spaces. and therefore transitioning into now positions of leadership within policy making spaces, so that those who are in leadership are not influenced by dealership, but by the actions that they have done for their communities and the respect that they gain from the communities that they serve. So that would be my reflection. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, and I think great questions generally. In terms of, and I'll briefly, because I think he's adequately addressed it just on the question of democracy. So I've worked in the region, I think, for a number of years now, and I had the privilege to observe the Kenya elections 2022. And so what was interesting is that I think there were 14 million voters who voted in general, right? So 14 million voters, but nearly 7 million people had IDs who are over the age of 18 and didn't turn out to vote, right? But our current president, I think, won with slightly over 7 million votes, barely over 50%. So what this means is that this 7 million people who had IDs and hadn't registered to vote, that's where the voter apathy is. And I think that's where we get like a lot of the change that we don't have. Currently in Kenya, there's a movement, I think you know, called Tukokadi, right? Which is pushing a lot of young people to vote. I think many of us here, I'm a Gen Z by birth and by generation. And I think most of us know at least 2 out of 3 of our friends who aren't registered and things such as those, right? And it just comes from, I think our parents had a culture of it was very intentional in terms of registering and voting was like a birthright, and so even making a line there, it's so important. But a lot of people our age are like, first of all, I don't want to wake up early, I don't want to have to make a line, and so we become so politically apathetic. And then there are certain issues that happen around us, and you realize you can't run away from the country that you live in, you can't run away from this world, and so then you're just frustrated and you don't know where to take a lot of these frustrations, which is what led to like the Gen Z protests. But I think we shouldn't give up on democracy generally. I think just because it's not working the way it's supposed to work, particularly in a lot of our African countries, doesn't necessarily mean that then we give up on it entirely. There's a lot of things that don't work. It just means we fine-tune them and we work on them a bit better. And even just touching on what he said about Uganda again, I follow very closely with NRM and even a lot of the challenges in terms of who gets a ticket. I think in NRM, for example, in Uganda, you'll find, for example, like 9,000 people are trying to get 200 and something party tickets. It's quite crazy because everyone realizes that to have even the slightest inch or access to power, you only have to go through one certain party. And what that means is that then you have a monopoly of power, right? And you don't have political systems that are very participatory. And you'll find that the people who can get those tickets many times aren't young people. So sometimes when we're told, you guys should rise up, you should go for these seats, I don't like it. I'm like, how? I don't have the money. And it's a trade-off in terms of my time because I'm building my career. It's either I choose to build my career or I choose to go into politics that doesn't seek to serve me. But I think particularly the situation in Uganda, in Tanzania, I think young people you need to wake up, and it sounds so bad, but we need to wake up and try to push as much as possible. At the end of the day, I don't think there's any president who can push 8 million people out of a country. I don't think you can kill 8 million people. I don't think you can necessarily disenfranchise 8 million people if we come together in the mass critical mass. And so even when there was the internet blackouts in Uganda, there were people by there who actually got Kenyan SIM cards and were trying to function and were trying to report on news. And so just because civic space is shrinking in certain places doesn't necessarily mean it's dead. And I think there's a lot more work we can be able to do. So I don't like 100% being doomsday about it. In terms of what you've spoken about, particularly with charcoal in Malawi, the county that we're in right now in Kenya, Machakos County, there's Makueni County as well. These are counties that have faced particularly a lot of issues with charcoal burning, and how communities in this case, they're told you can't cut down trees, particularly because you need those trees for your ecosystem, and they need those trees, for example, for their livestock and for their biodiversity, particularly when it gets really dry and it gets really hot. But at the end of the day, you can't tell me that someone won't be able to cook their evening meal. They won't be able to, for example, light a fire for their kids to be able to study and do their homework simply because they're supposed to preserve a tree. So I think that's why a lot of our climate justice solutions have to be quite they have to be quite tailored to people and to individuals. And that's why sometimes, even when we push to, there's a lot of campaigning going around on clean cooking and why that's so essential. I think for me, if we don't target the issue, which is usually affordability and accessibility, then that becomes an issue. And so when you work your way back, you find that why don't we have affordability? Many times there's a lot of tariffs on a lot of like the solar, on the solar lamps, on a lot of even the mini grids, for example, the compartments that come from China. And so you find that removing some of those tariffs, I think that has been done, for example, in Ethiopia, at least gets people slightly more access, right? You can have, for example, in a small community, you can have a what do you call it? It's not a mini grid, right? It's like a mini solar charging port, right? And it will serve like, let's say, around 100 people, and they can all be able to come to that spot. But you see, you need to empower that business to be able to buy the technology, to be able to then deploy it. I think even in the wave of climate justice and the movement in how we exist, I'd rather see communities, and it sounds so bad, but I'd rather see someone burning charcoal than then have us try to preserve land to sell carbon credits externally, because one of those is only benefiting, the right kind of person. And so if we don't create alternative solutions that are tailored for local people, and then you find that government is now just pushing carbon credits and they want to exclude people from their land and don't cut trees so we can be able to sell this carbon for profit to Meta and all these things. I think we'd rather have, for example, situations where people are, let's say, cutting trees, but then let's say replanting in other areas. There's counties that have adopted some of those mechanisms just so that there's sustainability and there's adoption of how people are able to live. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I shall be fast. I think the bulk of the questions are answered already. Well, I know you are young at heart and young in age. And these problems we are facing, the age of democracy, let's call it, is not an accident. We have been running away from military rule for a long time. And for us to get the irritation that some things are not working, let's go back to military rule. I think we will not emerge back easily from that corner. It's a very difficult terrain to navigate. But also context in the Sahel region. You are equally answering the democracy question. If you talk of the Ali Bongo era, the whole family running a country for almost close to 60 years. So you are actually saying we yearn for democracy, but you can't then yearn for democracy at the same time bring in military dictatorship. What you need is to strengthen the institutions so that they are better responsive to the changing context that we are situated in. I was laughing the other day listening to this Chinese scholar called Zheng Weiwei. He was juxtaposing Western democracy and Chinese democracy. And he says Western democracy is weak, the way it elects people compared to his. I'm not going to take a position, you make a decision. He was asked which works better. He says for Chinese democracy, they use what they call select and elect. And the Western democracy is mob democracy. That's what he's saying. And he says with the mob democracy, it has weak guardrails that you end up with a very incompetent person at the center. Yet in his own analysis, pushing for his own situation, he says for a Chinese to elect a head of state, firstly, they have to select from people who have run successfully as a governor. And a governor in China is as good as a European country. So if you have succeeded and you have a clean record, then you are up for selection. And then you'll be elected from that pool. And that's what he's saying. And my proposal is to say, and he says, with such a system, you don't end up having incompetent people like George Bush and the current one. So my proposal is for us as young people who are seated in the room to think carefully. What really makes it easy for someone to be competent at the helm of the state? Because in most of our jurisdictions, the state is the business. Our societies are small. We rely on the state, unlike, for example, the big powers like Kenya, like South Africa, like Nigeria. In other smaller jurisdictions, the state is the business. It provides the business for that country. And if you've got an incompetent person, literally you have decimated the entire society. But to give it over to the military is to reach a point of no return. In those societies where the military is in charge, I bet you to the last cent, no one has a clue when they are going to relinquish power. No one, not a single one. And they keep on changing the goalposts on the go. So I think there's need to rethink what we wanted the democracy to look like, where it is failing, how do we strengthen it, and try to have the citizen agency of the young people. The biggest dividend, as he is saying. This is the biggest dividend that swing the entire decision making of the entire country. And if there is active agency within that necessity, we'll move forward. The issue of internet shutdowns. This is another area where I'm saying 70% of the SDGs are about problems of Africa. And digital transformation is one of them. When Tanzania shut down the internet, the assumption was that nothing will emerge. But because of imaging technology, there is now satellite imaging real time. We need young people of your nature to come up with localized interventions that can actually monitor real time what's happening in an election where the internet is not working, and coordinate the geospatial images for the world to remain in action and alive to the developments that are happening. An election is not supposed to be a war zone, but in our situations at times it's life and death. And it is up to the young startups, young thinkers to propose new interventions. Where in long time Abeku you would go like a shutdown in Zimbabwe, it will be partial. This time they are going full scale that even the SMS services are not working. So how do you consolidate response mechanisms from satellite imaging and enabling digital infrastructure that is capable to release information when it is critically needed? Thank you.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to take the last round before our panelists close. And then yeah.
Thank you so much, Hadija Jilo. Thank you so much for bringing the point of joining political parties as a formal and informal structures to influence policies. So we as people coming from organizations in the grassroots levels, and we are living in an environment where there is lack of accountability and transparency. What does accountability look like for us as an organization? And also with the kind of leadership that we have that have been compromised in terms of integrity, how do we, as leaders, how do we remain people with integrity in such an environment?
Thank you. I'm Hubert. I'm just having kind of a quick concern to the 70% of SDGs being part of African problems. My really concern, my curiosity is how can we address these gaps to our African governments, and on how can we as a youth entrepreneurs being given that access to more resources, and also being accountable of fixing the 70% of the problems in SDG. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much to the panelists. It's a reaction, not a question, especially to Mr. Tabani. I think, you spoke directly to the work that I do, and it's kind of like an affirmation, like I have no second doubt of why I am here. I think I'm one person who notices or faces digital governance issue almost each and every day. When Zbusiso spoke during his presentation, he mentioned the issue of us not receiving contracts because of the issues of laws in different countries. I think it comes back also to the issue of digital governance, to say each and every country has their own laws when it comes to money transfers and any other things that happen in the digital space. And also when you touched on the issue of the rights-based approach, you mentioned that the government sometimes puts in place systems where they say it's for security. It reminds me one of the poems that I performed last year during the FIFA Africa. I think you were also there as a panelist in one of the sessions, where I say, sometimes they say it's for security, but what security if lives are on the line and if we can't express ourselves freely? And lastly, on the participatory, I think it's actually the goal that I'm trying to arrive at with my initiative, where we are talking all things internet shutdowns, using tools such as IOTA and UNE to try to measure internet shutdowns. Thank you.
Just take one more.
Yeah, thank you so much. Mine is a question. It goes mostly to Titus, but anyone else on the panel, if you have something to add, you can add. You said that citizens are the boss, and that's very true. And I think it's something that a lot of African states, leaders, and everyone forgets, that at the end of the day, when you meet that politician, when you meet that public servant, he's there to serve us first. But then when I relate to countries like Kenya and other countries, you guys have more vibrant youth as compared to countries like Malawi. Yes, our youth are vibrant, but in rare cases when we meet like difficulties with our leaders, most young people, they just give up. And for someone who has worked in the accountability space, I can't push people to do something if they are not willing to go on the panel. So my question is, how can I support young people in influencing issues of accountability? Of course, yes, we can say, oh no, they should have leadership positions, but not all of us can have those positions. There has to be other ways. What other ways can I empower other young people to support the accountability initiatives that we're doing so that they are not scared when they're faced with different issues? They should really stand up. How can I help my fellow colleagues? Thank you.
Lovely. So I'll take last two. Then, okay, let's take the
Thank you very much to all the panelists. In Africa, when we're talking about corruption, it has created systems that make it difficult for young people to maneuver around. Like even when you have innovative ideas, it is very difficult for you to implement those innovative ideas because the system is already there and you are always guided like this is how we go about it. My question is now, how can we young people be smart enough to say, even though the system is in place, this is how best we can do it to also avoid putting ourselves in danger? Because the moment you're not doing according to the system, you're likely to break the laws and you're likely to put yourself in danger. And also looking at the current shrinking civic space, it's very difficult to have resources. So that's a challenge. I think most of the young people in here are talking about working for grassroots organizations. And currently, a few grassroots organizations are in operation due to lack of resources. So in my question would be, given the limited resources that are available currently and the fact that we still don't have hope moving forward, what should we do as young people of Africa to make sure that we're still implementing these projects or initiatives with the little resources that we have?
Okay, thank you, panelists. And my questions goes to Mr. Taban and Ms. Wairimu. As Mr. Taban said that we are still lagging behind in achieving the SDGs as well as AU Agenda 2063. So in this context of achieving AU Agenda 2063 as well as our SDGs, how can African government ensure that the transitioning from this fossil fuel to clean energy is inclusive and remain accountable to all? Madam Wairimu gave us an example of Kenya, of which it's really doing great in renewable energy aspect. And she talked about Tanzania. We really rely in natural gas only, as well as Mozambique and Nigeria, which are more using in fossil fuel, especially in the oil. So about this one, how can we do, or how can we ensure that the community are not just a beneficial, but also participating active in this process of transitioning from the fossil fuel to clean energy sources. Thank you.
Thank you. So this is Derek, and my question is to Wairimu. It's a bit relating to my sister, but a bit different. So we all know that in most of the African countries, they do advocate the clean energy issues, but they use gases and the other ways because maybe they look for the common interest, maybe partnering with investors so as they can benefit. Now, what do you think are the affordable and accessible methods of energy solutions to the marginalized communities? Because we can speak of wind, we can speak of solar, but it can be inaccessible for the marginalized, really marginalized areas. Thank you.
Clap hands for yourselves.
So I think the mammoth task is with the panelists here. I may need you to compress and condense your responses. You group what is common. And if there is any question that we haven't addressed, please raise your hand, okay? Great. Yes, you can go ahead, Tatus.
All right. Thanks. Maybe very quickly just to try, and I think the solutions are really within the space. As we continue peer learning from each other, I think because like for the first question by Hadija on community structures for accountability, I think a lot of what you're doing already creating those structures. The approach of like identifying what are the community sort of traditional structures that people respect is one way of ensuring that there is a bit of continuity and that people reflect the accountability that's already been created within that society. An example, I come from the county where Wangari Maathai came from, Nyeri, and she did some level of activism that got her acknowledged globally, and she did it just by herself. And I think we've had so many examples of people who stand up with their own ideals and resolutions and resolutes to stand up against injustices. And this has happened. So if you follow, again, the Kenyan example is what we call vampire diaries. So just a young guy was going around showcasing what we call white elephants, like projects that were just started but never got completed. And it raised a lot of traction in the country, that he even now got some sort of threats. And like you've pointed out, so how do we protect ourselves? So again, because he was already within a space that he was doing his own business, so they used the tax approach to attack his business and all that. But because he was not very well connected to a community or organizations that could support, then you see it dimmed a bit. Yeah. So this sort of connection, this ecosystem that you're being told to be part of, is part of your protection. Like, be part of a group. Much as you have a conviction and you're doing something, also connect yourself to institutions, organizations, people who are resourceful and who can support your cause. So that sort of, I think, already recognizing, you have to do a risk analysis. Like, if you're a journalist, I've been engaging with a lot of journalists. They always, one of the basic mantras is that no story is worth your life. Yeah, so you have to do a risk assessment of what you're doing and see, would you rather do it by yourself or would you rather work with, if you're in like in Kenya, look for organizations that are working on climate justice, if that is your space. If it's accountability or anti-corruption, look for TI. What is it that they're doing, and how can you partner with them? So, and I think there is hope. I think for us, for the longest time, I've been in anti-corruption space for quite some time. And for me, June of 2024 in Kenya gave me hope that people actually listen. It's just the trigger that is missing of them to act. Yeah, so people use a lot of the information, like you provide them with that analysis of the budgets, those accountability issues, one way or another, that access to information is what creates participation. Without access to information, you cannot participate effectively. So you be that trigger, like providing this information, and already you guys are doing that. The storytelling bit, how we can fine-tune it to lived realities. Sometimes some of us within the space, we talk a bit big, like TI will say 7 billion gets lost every day or 2 billion, but it's not a lived reality for some people. They don't know, when you're talking about billions, what are you saying? Yeah. So just talk about their experiences when going to the hospital and not having access to medication, or going to the police station and be asked for fuel to go and look at the crime scene, or going to realities that they can associate themselves with. And that is why the Vampire Diaries campaign for a lot was very successful, because that individual was going to communities and pointing out this is a hospital. It started getting built in 2000. Right now we are in 2002 or 2022. Those are how many years? This thing, those resources that were used, there are people still getting sick and all those. So the lived realities is very important. And then there was, I think, a question on how do we, I think that's what I was saying. Like, how do we as citizens experience that being the boss thing, sort of, is just be the example that you want to see. Yeah, don't start very big. You might get challenges, and that is why I loved even the mantra in the morning that failure is part of the outcomes of the process. Yeah, work out something, do it, learn from that. As long as you're learning from it, then that is not failure. It's just part of the process. So yeah, I think keep at it, and I think always look out for those who can support and be part of your solution. Thanks.
Great. Wairimu?
Yeah. I think thank you so much. Just in terms of the corruption element, I think a lot of that question or those questions have been answered, but maybe intrinsically reflecting as a young person and what your role is. I think someone has asked, how do you protect yourself, for example, to ensure that sometimes you protect your values and you're not, you don't end up being used to a certain extent. I think a lot of us young people, particularly, if you're in a circle like this, you're exposed to a certain extent. And so what happens is when you go home, you might have more access, for example, than other young people, and it's what you use your platform for. I think, one, it's important to always keep your values. I think there's people who we've done several programs with, for example, that are right now campaigning all around the country, insulting the president, and they're being used as political tools to a certain extent to achieve an end. And, at the end of the day, I think our issues are not political individuals. Our issues are governance systems and institutions, as I said. So I think if you just keep your North Star, that's important. And sometimes it gets harder with money and tons of money being thrown at you. But I think even particularly in Kenya, we've seen so many examples where young people have, people who are leading, for example, the June 2024 movement right now are discredited, right? They're people who can't be able to stand at a single stage. They have no credibility in this country because they were used, by political parties to then co-opt the movement into their system. And so sometimes you have to think about your credibility, the movement you're building, a lot of the impact that you want to create. I think that's sometimes more important than some of those financial benefits. And now just going into the conversation, particularly on what the energy transition would look like. And usually I think, and this is a lot of the global climate justice movement has been towards stopping fossil fuels, decommissioning coal plants. And a lot of times the arguments that government come with are like, okay, look, for example, we need to meet 10,000 megawatts demand. How do we meet that demand if you're saying these coal plants won't go through because this is dirty fuel, for example? And so then there's been need for a lot of CSOs to come in and that's, for example, my background, right? The organization I work for, Law for Energy Transitions Africa, a lot of the team moved from fighting coal, fighting gas in South Africa to now starting to do a lot of work towards enabling access to renewable energy. And for me, personally, I came from the private sector background where I was doing a lot of deals, particularly legal deals towards ensuring we have, helping investors basically invest in clean energy projects. And I remember there are times questions would come in terms of like, if there's a wind power plant in northern Kenya, and the question is, there's communities who live on this land, and my boss would typically just say, those guys, just give them some small money and they'll be able to walk away, right? But if you think about it, you wouldn't be able to have that, to have your projects without the land. And a lot of times, a lot of people are so disenfranchised that even in themselves, the scale of money that's coming in from those project finance, from the project financing is so big that they can't be able to envision how much is actually owed to them. And so even part of, and maybe I can share some of these resources later, we're trying to commission a benefit sharing agreement, right? I mean, a benefit sharing agreement expert note that basically speaks to the different ways that communities can be engaged from the onset. But what that also means is that a lot of CSOs, a lot of grassroots youth organizations, for example, will have to upskill. How many of us knows what goes into a project financing agreement? How many of us knows what project financing is, right? It's the specific kind of financing that goes into energy projects in Africa. It's usually not based on it's not asset-based financing. It's usually based on, for example, the projections of how much money you're going to make. So that's what banks finance. And what you now need to understand from that is how can communities come in, right? Because then land isn't necessarily being valued as an asset. They'd need to, for example, then in that case, buy equity. How much equity would they need to buy? They'd need to buy, for example, like 10% equity, 5% equity. That's sometimes millions and millions of shillings, for example, that communities cannot be able to afford. So then we have to then come in with and that's been the most persistent problems with how we are targeting issues, right? We're saying communities deserve rights. Investors, private sector is looking at you like, look, even us, for example, we barely break even 8 years after this project is implemented. So we need to be able to get our money back. So if the community wants to be able to buy into the business, they need the money. And so that's where a lot of conversations come in. For example, in South Africa, there's equity, they're called private equity investors that actually fund community trusts. So you'd need to get your communities to register. You then be able to get your communities to lease this land, and maybe lease the land to the private equity investor for a certain percentage of money, which they'll use to buy into their business, right? It's a lot of financial modeling. And it's the fact that a lot of civil society people, sometimes we don't want to also sometimes open our minds, or it's very technical, right? So we don't want to upskill to be able to learn, okay, what needs to be done to be able to get these communities there at the end of the day. Or even in our fundraising, right? Why don't we fundraise for legal advice for these communities to be able to then be structured into those community benefit sharing agreements? So there's just a lot of need has evolved beyond generally fundraising against, not necessarily fundraising for advocacy to empower communities. It's maybe fundraise for legal technical capacity to help with these transactions and a lot of that. So we'd also need to change a lot of how, I'm wrapping up. We'd need to change a lot of how, for example, we do our strategies and a lot of how we do our implementation in projects. But secondly, in terms of issues of access generally, and this is not necessarily, and so there's two types of access that I think African countries are faced with. There's affordability. There's people, for example, in informal settlements who the grid passes through them, right? But they can't be able to afford, for example, in Nairobi, the average cost of power is around 2,000 to 3,000 a month, right? For someone, that's the difference between them getting a meal and them being able to afford power. So what does that mean? There's a lot of illegal connections. What do illegal connections then place people at risk of, right? When you find there's a lot of fires that happen in informal settlements, a lot of that happens because of these illegal connections. And so there's affordability, there's inaccessibility because of affordability, and then there's inaccessibility because probably you live so far from the grid, so the national grid cannot be able to get to you. This is not necessarily as much of an issue in Kenya as it is, for example, maybe in Tanzania, in Malawi, I think. But even, for example, in Kenya, the 15% who the national grid doesn't get to, how can we be able to get solutions for them, right? So again, a very technical conversation. There's mini grids, for example, development that can be able to be financed, for example, through joint cooperatives. I know there's organizations, I think, such as Power Shift Africa, which are working for equitable solutions solutions, particularly for communities such as who are so far away from the grid to be able to access power. But then we work, for example, on ensuring that some of then our procurement frameworks at national level are so equitable or are so transparent and accountable that then they don't reflect in high power tariffs. Because if, for example, our power procurement a power purchase agreement is denominated in the dollar currency, right? It means that if the dollar goes up, every 3 months the price of your power goes up because they have to be able to pay the supplier that amount of money. But you find some of those terms are quite crazy in, for example, countries like Kenya, where the currency really doesn't fluctuate as much. Or even, for example, if a country like Ethiopia or maybe in Malawi, where the currency fluctuates, there are other ways to mitigate that currency fluctuation other than inputting foreign currency mechanisms into those PPAs. So there's just different mechanisms that you can be able to learn. But I think all in all, upskilling is so important to be able to face some of these challenges or to tackle some of these challenges that we face, particularly in energy and the climate crisis. I can be able, I think, to share some documentation after, just if you'd be able to want to understand, first of all, the UNFCCC TRIP framework, but also some of these mechanisms that have been created, and you can be able to start from there.
Thank you. In 1 minute, 70% of the challenges of Africa. In responding to this, I want to give you a bigger problem that the intersection between energy and digital governance is not abstract. If you want to digitally transform and upscale development or deployment of technologies, you need energy and in excess supply and uninterrupted. Why? Because we are saying we want to be active players in the AI next phase, the fourth revolution. We want to be players. But if you want to be players, you need savers. Savers need uninterrupted access to energy. That's 1. 2, savers need water. They drink more than human beings. So are you able to have that healthy balance of competing water for human beings and technology? So have that bigger picture at the back of your mind that even the 70% of the SDGs we are fighting for, it's access to water, access to peaceful environment to develop inclusively. And when we are solving those things, 90% of the solutions for African problems are SMEs, small to medium economies. Those anchor our solutions. And if you want new entries to the supply chain of energy, democratize the energy supply system so that you have got local, small-scale producers of energy who also stimulate local interventions at AI development. By so doing, you are helping in the collective bigger picture of solving the 70% deficit of our problems, which are in the SDGs. And I hope that in a way, you will manage to help us to achieve that.
Wow. Okay, interesting. So I think because of my time, I will take this conversation as a conversation kickstarter to the bigger conversation that we're going to have throughout the bootcamp. And I'm happy to say some of these experts are going to be with us for the next 2 days so that we unpack at length those issues that they have brought to the table. So thank you so much for this very informative conversation that you have been a part of. And in closing, I would like to challenge you to mention in one phrase or statement or word an inspirational message to these young people right here. Because it's quite heavy what you're sharing. Like the problem is so big, it's so huge. So what would be your words of encouragement going forward? I will start with you, Tabani. All things to do with digital governance. What's your word of encouragement? All things to do with climate justice. What is your word of encouragement? All things to do with accountability. What is your word of encouragement to the young people who are here in this room and those who are watching from their respective places?
Well, Africans are not lesser humans, and the quality of our life depends on your creative mindsets and how you help to solve these problems. Thank you.
Well, I think that's so profound. Yeah.
Poetry.
Yeah. I think in the spirit of that, for me, it's also just believing in your own capacity, particularly as a young person, because there's a lot of external reinforcements that kind of would try to push you down. But being here, I think you're taking the next step, and there's a lot more steps that you need to take. So just keep moving forward. It's difficult. Keep moving.
Great, thanks. I think I'll follow with the creativity bit of it and dedicate a song for you listening. Man in the Mirror by Michael Jackson. Just listen to it and see if it inspires you to be that person that you are looking at, because integrity starts with you. Yeah, thank you.
Lovely. All right. Thank you so much for being part of this conversation, and I'm sure it inspired you as much as it has inspired me. And it is my hope that you keep following these conversations on all our social media platforms, at Alessa, at Accountability Lab Alessa, on Facebook, on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on TikTok, and we continue learning from each other, everything to do with civic leadership, engagement, human rights, accountability, and rights. It's been a pleasure. My name is Vatabile Dlamini. Until next time, we catch up again on this platform. Thank you so much.
Cut holes in the socks when I heat those. Reason why I swerve on the track. On to the next arm and the leg with the price of the fame. And my love for the game. Pass it on to my friend.